From shallow bays to the deepest ocean trenches, fishermen have pulled creatures out of the water that broke every record and shattered every expectation. A 2,664-pound great white, a grouper big enough to swallow a shark whole, a catfish the size of a grizzly bear. These aren't flukes. They're proof that the ocean and the rivers still hold giants we can barely comprehend. Today we're counting down the most gigantic catches ever caught on camera. 20. The great white shark. The heaviest fish ever caught on a rod and reel was landed by a citrus farmer. Alfred Dean boarded a charter boat called the Victory out of Ceduna, South Australia on April 21, 1959, loaded with 2 oversized mustad hooks, a Pen 14/0 reel crammed with 130-pound test line, and a bucket of whale oil dripping over the side to lay a slick that drifted for miles. Dean had already broken his own world record twice, landing great whites at 2,333 pounds and then 2,536 pounds in the years before. But what surfaced that autumn morning was a different animal entirely. A great white shark that, once hauled back to the docks at Nile Bay, tipped the official scales at 2,664 pounds, stretching 16 feet 10 inches from nose to tail. The whole fight lasted roughly 50 minutes. And since great white sharks are now fully protected worldwide, that gap between Dean's record and the next closest catch, which sits at over 750 pounds below him, will almost certainly never close. 19. The black marlin. 3/4 of a century ago, an oil tycoon named Alfred Glassell Jr. was trolling a cerro mackerel as bait off Cabo Blanco, Peru, when something hit his line so hard it nearly yanked the rod from his hands. The date was August 4, 1953. The marlin fought him for an hour and 45 minutes, throwing itself into the air 49 times before it finally ran out of energy. When they brought the fish alongside the boat, it weighed 1,560 pounds and measured 14 feet 6 inches long with a girth of 6 feet 9 inches. The IGFA certified it as the all-tackle world record for black marlin, and over 70 years later, nobody has come close. A Warner Brothers film crew happened to be at the Cabo Blanco Fishing Club that same day, shooting footage for the screen adaptation of Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. They filmed Glassell's fight, and that real footage made it directly into the finished movie. The marlin itself now hangs on the wall of the Smithsonian. 18. The Atlantic bluefin tuna. Ken Fraser needed just 45 minutes. That is how long it took the Nova Scotia angler to bring the largest Atlantic bluefin tuna anyone has ever seen close enough to gaff, fishing with Captain Eric Sampson aboard a vessel called the Lady and Misty out of Port Hood, Nova Scotia, on October 26, 1979. After nearly 10 hours dehydrating in the boat, the fish still weighed an incredible 1,496 pounds on the certified scales. The IGFA stamped it as the all-tackle world record, and that record has now stood for over 46 years. Fraser spent the rest of his life advocating for sustainable bluefin fisheries in the Canadian Maritimes, helping transform the region from heavy commercial harvest into a world-class catch-and-release charter destination. He passed away peacefully on October 24, 2025, at the age of 81, just 2 days before the 46th anniversary of his legendary catch. Earlier that year, a full-scale replica of his record fish was unveiled at the Wonders of Wildlife National Museum in Springfield, Missouri. 17. The colossal squid. A New Zealand fishing crew was hauling up toothfish lines from the freezing waters of the Ross Sea in February of 2007 when something on the end of one line refused to let go. Their vessel, the San Aspiring, had hooked into more than toothfish. A colossal squid had latched onto one of the hooked toothfish roughly 5,000 feet below the surface and rode it all the way up, tangled in the lines and barely alive by the time it broke through. The crew filmed the entire retrieval, and what they hauled aboard weighed 495 kilograms, which comes out to 1,091 pounds once you do the conversion. Its eyes measured 27 centimeters across, roughly the diameter of a dinner plate, making them the largest eyes ever documented in the animal kingdom. The specimen remains the heaviest squid and the heaviest invertebrate ever captured intact by humans. It sits on permanent display at Te Papa Museum in Wellington, New Zealand, preserved in a glass-top tank where visitors can stand face-to-face with a creature that spent its entire life hunting in total darkness at the bottom of the Southern Ocean. 16. The tiger shark. 3 brothers from Galveston entered a high-stakes fishing tournament in the Gulf of Mexico carrying a family story that most people would have dismissed as tall tale material. Their father had landed a massive tiger shark in those same waters 3 decades earlier, and the sons wanted to follow in his footsteps. After hours of being dragged through the dark Gulf, they brought a tiger shark alongside the boat that measured 12 feet 6 inches long and weighed 1,040 pounds. Biologists estimated the animal was over 20 years old, a fully mature apex predator that had been patrolling the warm Gulf currents since before the brothers were old enough to hold a fishing rod. Tiger sharks are among the least selective eaters in the ocean, known to consume sea turtles, seabirds, and even license plates, so one of this size would have been an absolute ruler of its stretch of water. The family photo from that day, 3 brothers with the same shark species their father caught a generation earlier, became one of the most shared fishing images in Texas that year. 15. The $6.2 million blue marlin. On the final day of the 50th annual White Marlin Open in August of 2023, Maryland angler John Wels was fishing aboard the Ocean City-based boat floor reel when he hooked into something that pulled like a freight train. The blue marlin he brought to the scales that evening measured 118 inches and weighed 640.5 pounds. And because it happened to be the only qualifying billfish in the entire 5-day tournament, it swept every single prize category. The total payout came to $6.2 million, the largest fishing tournament purse in recorded history. 357 teams had competed that week. 551 white marlin and 46 blue marlin were caught across the fleet. And in one of those details that makes the story feel scripted, basketball legend Michael Jordan was competing in the same tournament aboard his 84-foot custom Viking yacht, Catch 23. Jordan went home empty-handed. The local guy from Laytonsville with the 640-pound marlin walked away a multi-millionaire. 14. The giant freshwater stingray. It took about a dozen men to haul her to shore. A fisherman named Kon Sofo was working his lines near Ko Prea, a remote island in the Mekong River in northern Cambodia, on June 13, 2022, when he hooked into something that dwarfed every fish he had ever pulled from the water. He called researchers from the Wonders of the Mekong Conservation Project, and when they placed the creature on 3 scales side by side, the number came back at 661 pounds. A female giant freshwater stingray, over 13 feet from snout to tail, wider than a ping-pong table if you stretched her disc flat. It took about a dozen men to haul her to shore. The team named her Borami, which means full moon in the Khmer language, because she was released back into the river as a full moon was rising at dusk. Guinness certified Borami in the 2024 edition of their record book as the largest freshwater fish ever officially documented, toppling the previous record held by a 646-pound Mekong giant catfish caught in Thailand back in 2005. After tagging her with an electronic tracker, they gently slid her back into the current to continue roaming free. 13. The world record yellowfin tuna. Only 4 yellowfin tuna over 400 pounds have ever been documented on rod and reel in all of recorded history, and Earl Gill IV from North Carolina caught one of them on his very first trip targeting the species. He was on a 10-day long-range run aboard the Excel out of San Diego on November 11, 2024, when his chunk bait, sitting about 150 feet down off the lower banks of Baja, got absolutely crushed. The fight lasted 1 hour and 45 minutes, and when the crew finally sank the gaffs, they hauled aboard a yellowfin tuna that read 448 pounds on the boat scale. Because the Excel was still days from port, the fish had to be refrigerated, and by the time they weighed it on a certified IGFA scale at Fisherman's Landing in San Diego 6 days later, it came in at 443 pounds, still 16 pounds over the previous world record. The IGFA certified it as the new all-tackle benchmark for yellowfin tuna. In the sport fishing world, any yellowfin over 200 pounds is called a cow. Anything over 300 is a super cow. Topping 400 puts a fish in a category where only 4 yellowfin have ever been documented on rod and reel in all of recorded history. Gills was his very first cow. 12. The giant squid. Thousands of submersible expeditions into the deep ocean had tried and failed to film a giant squid in American waters. So in June of 2019, a team of NOAA-funded researchers tried something different. They dropped a stealth camera called the Medusa into the Gulf of Mexico, roughly 100 miles southeast of New Orleans. The camera uses red lights invisible to deep-sea creatures and an electronic lure called the E-jelly that mimics the glow of a deep-sea jellyfish. On its 5th deployment, a scientist reviewing the footage spotted something large sliding in from the corner of the screen. Long tentacles reached out of the pitch-black water and wrapped around the lure before the creature realized it was fake and pulled away. Experts from NOAA Fisheries confirmed it was a juvenile giant squid of the genus Architeuthis, estimated at 10 to 12 feet in length, filmed at a depth of 2,490 feet. It was only the second time a live giant squid had ever been captured on camera anywhere in the world, and the first time one had been documented in American waters. The footage proved what researchers had long suspected. The reason thousands of submersible expeditions had never produced a giant squid sighting was that these animals actively flee from bright lights. Stealth was the key all along. 11. The Goliath grouper. Captain Jimmy Wheeler saw the shadow rising from under the hull and grabbed his camera before anyone else on the boat knew what was about to happen. This was July of 2018, about 20 miles offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, and Wheeler, a guide with the Everglades Fishing Company, had a charter group that had just hooked a 3-foot reef shark. As the fishermen started reeling it in, Wheeler spotted a massive shadow rising from beneath the hull. He grabbed his camera, pointed it at the water, and said to his clients, "You guys are going to freak out." A Goliath grouper estimated at 500 pounds surged upward, opened its mouth wide enough to park a basketball inside, and inhaled the entire shark in a single gulp. The fishermen fought the line for a few minutes before the grouper spit the shark back out. Wheeler's wife, Michelle, later told Fox News the same grouper came back afterward and swallowed a stingray. Goliath groupers have been federally protected in Florida since 1990 due to population declines, and they can grow up to 800 pounds. Local fishermen have started calling them the garbage disposals of the sea because they will eat literally anything that fits in their mouth. 10. The record Wels catfish. Alessandro Biancardi was completely alone on his boat when it happened. The Italian pro angler had launched into the River Po in northern Italy on May 25, 2023, casting a soft plastic swim bait into muddy water as the river level dropped after a flood. He was alone when he felt a powerful bite, and the fish dragged him through 40 minutes of strong currents and submerged obstacles that nearly snapped his line multiple times. When the fish finally surfaced, Biancardi said his voice was shaking because he was staring at the biggest Wels catfish he had seen in 23 years of professional fishing. He wrestled it into the shallows, then had to actually swim after his own boat when the fish started dragging it downstream. With 10 witnesses watching from a nearby fishing camp, they laid a measuring tape along the creature's body, and the tape stopped at 285 centimeters, which translates to 9 feet 4 inches, beating the previous world record for a Wels catfish by just 1.6 inches. That earlier record had been set in the same river only 2 months before. After documenting everything, Biancardi released the fish back into the Po, choosing science over bragging rights. 9. Dino Ferrari's Wels catfish. 8 years before Biancardi's record, Italian fisherman Dino Ferrari and his brother Dario were working the Po Delta when Dino hooked into a Wels catfish that took an artificial surface lure and immediately plowed for the bottom. The fight from the boat lasted 40 minutes, and when they finally hauled the beast into the shallows, they weighed it in a sling at 280 pounds and measured it at 8.8 feet long. At the time, the UK Mirror reported it as the largest Wels catfish ever caught with a rod and reel. These fish average about 6.5 feet in the Po Delta, so anything approaching 9 feet is considered extremely rare. The brothers shot video of Dino holding the enormous fish in the shallows to show its full girth, then released it back into the water. The footage went viral and was picked up by CNN, USA Today, and half the tabloids in the UK, turning a quiet Italian river into the global epicenter of monster catfish stories. 8. Pignose the white sturgeon. For decades, fishing guides and sporting goods shops around Lillooet, British Columbia, swapped stories about a white sturgeon they called pignose, a fish so large and so slippery that half the locals figured it was pure myth. The sturgeon earned its name from a bizarre, flat pink deformity on its snout, the result of an injury roughly 40 years earlier that healed into something that genuinely looked like a pig's nose. On August 23, 2016, 19-year-old fishing guide Nick McCabe was wrapping up a slow day on the Fraser River when a massive fish leaped clean out of the water right in front of his boat. McCabe told his clients, "That looks like a 10-footer, so strap on, we are in for a 2-hour fight." 2 hours and 15 minutes later, they brought Pignose to the surface. 10 feet 2 inches long, 5.5 feet in girth, an estimated 650 pounds, and somewhere between 80 and 90 years old based on microchip records. McCabe caught Pignose again the following year, and the fish had put on another 50 pounds. His co-workers at River Monster Adventures immediately dubbed him the Sturgeon Whisperer. 7. The alligator gar. A 6-pound test line is thinner than what most people use for panfish, and Art Weston used one to land a 283-pound prehistoric monster. The Kentucky angler stepped aboard Captain Kirk Kirkland's boat, the Garship Enterprise, on Sam Rayburn Lake in East Texas on September 2, 2023, targeting IGFA line class records for alligator gar. He hooked into something that immediately felt impossibly heavy, and the fight lasted 2 hours and 45 minutes. When the fish finally surfaced, Weston was staring at a prehistoric predator with a crocodile-like snout and armored scales that looked like medieval chainmail, an alligator gar measuring 100 inches long, 48 inches in girth, and weighing 283 pounds. Kirkland estimated it was at least 100 years old, meaning this fish had been cruising those waters since before the First World War. The previous all-tackle record for the species had stood since 1951. Alligator gar are living fossils whose lineage stretches back over 100 million years, and the fact that Weston landed this one on a 6-pound line is the kind of thing that makes even veteran anglers shake their heads. 6. The arapaima. Czech adventure angler Jakub Wagner has spent his career chasing what he calls freshwater giants, the 24 biggest predatory species living in the world's rivers and lakes. On February 18, 2010, deep in the Amazon basin, he caught the one that would define everything: an arapaima gigas, the world's largest scaled freshwater fish, weighing 339 pounds 8 ounces and measuring 116 inches long with a 55-inch girth. The IGFA certified it as the all-tackle world record. Arapaima are air breathers that surface every 10 to 20 minutes with an audible gulp, and they can launch their full body out of the water with enough force to knock a person clean out of a canoe. Local fishermen in the Amazon have long reported arapaima snatching birds from overhanging branches, and Wagner's expedition, filmed for his National Geographic Channel show Fish Warrior, gave global audiences their first close look at a fish that indigenous communities had been telling stories about for generations. 5. The ocean sunfish. The ocean sunfish, known scientifically as mola mola, holds the title of the heaviest bony fish on Earth, and seeing one in person is the kind of experience that makes you question everything you thought you knew about what a fish looks like. Adults can exceed 5,000 pounds and stretch over 10 feet from fin tip to fin tip. Yet their bodies are flattened sideways like someone took a normal fish and compressed it through a hydraulic press. They have no real tail fin, no swim bladder, and their primary diet is almost entirely jellyfish, which means they need to eat absolutely staggering quantities just to keep their bulk going. A sunfish can consume hundreds of jellyfish in a single day and still barely break even on calories. Divers across the Atlantic and Mediterranean regularly film encounters with these slow-moving giants, and the reaction is always the same: total disbelief that something this bizarre actually exists, followed by the realization that it is completely harmless and genuinely curious about the person floating next to it. Marine biologists with NOAA have extensively documented the species, And despite being one of the most widely distributed ocean fish on the planet, every single piece of footage still manages to make people stop scrolling. 4. The placental jellyfish. Nobody could agree on what it was. A remotely operated camera attached to an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, running at nearly 5,000 feet below the surface in May of 2012, had captured footage of a translucent, billowing creature drifting through the pitch-black water like a living parachute. The video went viral within days, and the internet spent weeks arguing over what it was, with guesses ranging from a whale placenta to something completely unknown to science. Marine biologists identified the creature by the hexagonal pattern on its membranous bell as Deepstaria reticulum, an extremely rare deep-sea jellyfish first described back in 1988. The species gets its genus name from the Deep Star 4000, a French submarine that Jacques Cousteau used in the 1960s. Deepstaria has no tentacles at all. Instead, it traps prey by rapidly closing its bell around small crustaceans and fish like a living grocery bag and slowly digests them inside. Its ghostly, rhythmic pulsing through the midnight zone remains some of the most hauntingly beautiful deep-sea footage ever recorded, and it is a reminder that 95% of the ocean floor is still completely unexplored. 3. The Galapagos tortoise. Most of the creatures on this list were pulled from the water, but this one walked off a truck. A male Galapagos tortoise named Emerson, approximately 100 years old and weighing about 400 pounds, arrived at the Toledo Zoo from the San Diego Zoo in late August, and the footage of handlers carefully guiding this enormous ancient reptile into its new enclosure went viral almost immediately. Galapagos tortoises are among the largest tortoise species on the planet, with males measuring up to 6 feet long and tipping scales at 500 pounds. They can live for 150 years or longer, which means Emerson has potentially been alive since before the Great Depression. This is the same species that Charles Darwin observed when he traveled to the Galapagos Islands in 1835, and the information he gathered from studying them helped shape his theory of evolution by natural selection, which became the cornerstone of modern biological science. Before pirates and whalers started hunting them centuries ago, Galapagos tortoises are thought to have numbered in the tens of thousands. 4 of the species' 14 subspecies have gone extinct since then, and the surviving populations face constant pressure from non-native animals that humans introduced to the islands. 2. The basking shark. The crew of a commercial trawler working the Bass Strait off Portland in southwestern Australia had no idea what was in their nets until they hauled them up in June of 2015. A basking shark, the second largest fish species on the planet after the whale shark, measuring 6.3 meters long, which converts to just over 20 feet, and weighing roughly 7,716 pounds. The shark was already dead when it came aboard, but the crew recognized how significant the find was, and contacted Museum Victoria in Melbourne rather than selling the carcass. Scientists from the museum traveled to Portland to examine the specimen, and they were practically giddy about it because the museum had only 3 basking shark samples in its entire 160-year collection, all of them over 80 years old. Basking sharks are gentle filter feeders with teeth only about 2 millimeters long, and they survive by swimming with their enormous mouths wide open, trapping plankton and small jellyfish. They can grow up to 12 meters, roughly 39 feet, and despite their massive size, sightings in Australian waters are genuinely rare. The museum used the head and fins to build a full-scale exhibition model. 1. The Nile perch. In the massive freshwater expanse of Lake Victoria, the largest lake in Africa and the second largest freshwater lake on Earth, local fishing crews regularly pull in Nile perch so heavy it takes 4 men just to lift one off the deck of a wooden boat. Nile perch are aggressive apex predators that were originally introduced to Lake Victoria in the 1960s and 70s, and they took over the ecosystem so completely that they wiped out hundreds of native fish species within a few decades. A fully grown Nile perch can weigh over 440 pounds, and viral footage from fishing villages in Uganda shows crews struggling to haul barrel-chested silver fish that look more like torpedoes with fins than anything you would expect from a freshwater lake. The species is so dominant that an estimated 300 tons of Nile perch are commercially harvested from Lake Victoria every single day, year-round, and the fish just keeps thriving. A single mature female can lay up to 14 million eggs in one season, which helps explain how these enormous predators continue to show up in catches that leave even experienced local fishermen wide-eyed. Sport fishing records from Murchison Falls National Park in Uganda show rod and reel catches exceeding 250 pounds, and the commercial net record from the lake goes well over 400. The footage of village fishermen wrestling these silver giants off their boats and onto the shore has been shared millions of times online, and for good reason. It is hard to believe a freshwater lake produces fish this big until you see 4 grown men struggling to hold one up for a photo. And that's all for today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one. 1. Here's the rewritten version now.